it's very extensively documented that, in the past, there was a worldwide flood. Most only think that those on the Ark had survived, but that's not the only way that something could have survived. Almost every civilization across the world has extensive documentation of a devastating flood that wiped out almost all life on Earth, and these records are not the only evidence of such an event. Although there was, evidently, a mass extinction of life, there are, in fact, many ways that a living creature could have survived this cataclysm. Many people wonder how giants and other creatures were around after the flood, if the flood had wiped them all out. Due to hydrodynamics, the floodwaters wouldn't have reached everything and every hidden place. There are ways that ancient people, aside from those on the Ark, prepared for the flood and survived. And in many cases, there were people who didn't prepare who also survived. There are countless reports from across the world that describe various types of humanoids sheltering underground to survive a flood. It's even possible that many pre-flood life forms lived in caves prior to the cataclysm in order to hide from attackers, predators, and the natural disasters that increasingly occurred up to the time of the Great Flood. So they might have already been in a secure location underground when the worldwide flood happened. One example of an ancient legend that describes people having fled underground to survive the Great Flood involves the Basajaun, Mairuak, and Jentilak of Basque folklore. These are three closely related groups of what are described as gigantic and usually hairy humanoids from the ancient past, which have been sighted in the mountains and in the caves across Spain. Their ancestors are believed to have been the builders of the megalithic structures in the area. They had taught metalworking and agriculture to humans in the distant past. The Basajaun are supposedly more intelligent and calmer, while the Mairuak and Jentilak are savage and animalistic. The Jentilak, in particular, are known to roar loudly like animals, but with a more human tone, and people claim to have heard their calls echoing throughout the mountains and forests. The various temperaments of the Basajaun, Mairuak, and Jentilak are comparable to the different types of Bigfoot, which were encountered not just in North America, but across the world, some of which are said to be calmer and more intelligent, while others are more aggressive and savage. According to Basque folklore, these giant humanoids had fled underground and blocked the entrances with giant stones. And it's said that the end of these giants was ushered in after a swarm of dark clouds appeared that forced them into hiding. But they're said to still live underground to this day, and they occasionally come to the surface for food and other resources. In Mesoamerican legends, the 7 Nawa tribes were said to have emerged from caves that they call Chicomoztoc, which means the place of the 7 caves, following a great flood, which had wiped out most of the giants, whom the Aztecs called the Quinametzin. But some of the Quinametzin had also fled into caves to survive the great flood. But while the humans had taken refuge in Chicomoztoc, the Quinametzin were said to have taken refuge in the caves of the Tlalocan mountain. As the Aztec story of the giants goes, 7 brothers were saved in the caves of the Tlalocan mountain. And as for Chicomoztoc, where the 7 Nawa tribes had emerged from, Moctezuma I had led an expedition into caves that he believed were Chicomoztoc. The ancestors of the Aztecs, who had been one of the 7 Nawa tribes, known as the Mexica, had been subjected to tyrannical rulership by subterranean entities. But the Mexica people were taken away from these tyrannical rulers by a so-called god that they called Huitzilopochtli. But after Huitzilopochtli had taken them away and pretended to be their rescuer, He then demanded blood sacrifices from them, and they were forced by fear to sacrifice to Huitzilopochtli more than any of their other so-called gods. The Inca have legends of an ancient event that they call Unu Pachakuti, when the majority of the giants who had lived on the earth in the distant past were destroyed by a flood that rose above the highest mountains, and this great flood was said to have left Lake Titicaca and deposited seashells on the Altiplano, and interestingly, this flood was said to have come from the north. In order to escape the flood, some of the giants were said to have fled to the highest mountains that they could find. After the Great Flood, a group of men referred to as the Ayar brothers and their families emerged out of caves in the Pacaratambo mountain. One of the brothers had remains in the cave, and the entrance was resealed with a large stone. During their journeys after emerging from the cave, the rest of the Ayar brothers encountered remnants of the pre-flood civilization, such as a giant stone statue. The last of the Ayar brothers had settled in the fertile lands and founded the city of Cusco. According to the Hopi Native American tribe of southwestern North America, there were mysterious beings who the Hopi called the Sinom, which means ant people, who had led the ancestors of the Hopi underground in order to survive a cataclysm in the ancient past. The ant people were not the same as regular humans, according to the Hopi. They were described as having long limbs, large eyes, and advanced intelligence and knowledge. These ant people had taught the ancestors of the Hopi how to use their quote-unquote third eye to see in the dark underground caverns, and how to use other materials that were underground, like crystals, to create their own light. And they were taught how to grow beans underground, using very little light and water. And the ant people were said to have taught them how to build their dwellings into the rocks, like the ant people did. The Hopi believe that the earth was destroyed by a fire, and then by ice, because when they had entered into the cave shelters, there had been volcanic eruptions and earthquakes, and when their people had re-emerged from the cave system after the flood, they thought that the earth had been destroyed by ice, because they found that the earth had entered into an ice age state as a result of the Great Flood. The Lakota tribe, which is located in the north-central United States, also has legends of their ancestors having fled into the Wind Cave to survive a great flood in the ancient past. According to the Lakota creation legend, which explains the circumstances that had preceded their emergence from the Wind Cave, the creating power said to himself, "I will sing 3 songs, which will bring a heavy rain. Then I'll sing a 4th song, and stamp 4 times on the earth, and the earth will crack wide open. Water will come out of the cracks, and cover the lands." When he sang the 1st song, it started to rain. When he sang the 2nd, it poured. When he sang the 3rd, the rain-swollen rivers overflowed their beds. But when he sang the 4th song, and stamped on the earth, it split open in many places, like a shattered gourd, and water flowed from the cracks until it covered everything. The Lakota people consider Wind Cave in South Dakota to be the place where they had emerged from the earth's surface after the Great Flood. And this entrance to the Wind Cave was the only existing entrance to this massive underground complex, which exceeds 167 miles, or 269 kilometers. And they could have easily placed a stone over this hole in order to block water from entering. And since this cave system is so massive, there were many places that any water that did enter wouldn't have reached. And so, they would have been able to survive the flood by hiding in this cave system, which was all but completely concealed underground, except for this very small entrance. And this larger entrance to the Wind Cave that exists nowadays was only created in 1890 by using dynamite, so that Wind Cave could be more easily turned into a tourist location. But before 1890, there was no other entrance to the Wind Cave aside from this very small hole, which is just large enough for people to slip in and out of. The Mizo people in India have a very similar creation story that was passed to them from their ancestors. In the distant past, there was a calamity which was said to have plunged the earth into darkness, and forced their ancestors to retreat into a deep cave system that they call Chhinlung, which means cave that opens and closes. They had waited underground for many generations, not knowing when it was safe to emerge. Eventually, they left Chhinlung by small groups, keeping the entrance sealed with a large stone for protection. The Mizo people call their ancestors the Chhinlung Chuak, which means coming out of the earth. The first inhabitants of New Zealand's South Islands were said to be giant humanoids called the Kahui Tipua. Originally, the giants lived in villages, but according to Maori legends, these giants were driven away into the caves when a massive flood was sent to destroy them. The Kahui Tipua were described as massive man-eaters, and to this day, these giants are said to live in caves deep in the mountains in New Zealand. In Norse mythology, the earth is symbolically connected to a primordial giant named Ymir. The Norse believed that the sweat of Ymir created the Jotnar, who were giants, and the blood of Ymir created a worldwide flood when it was slain, and this flood was said to have destroyed most of the Jotnar. And then new entities, called the Elfar, or elves, were said to have emerged out of the flesh of Ymir after it was destroyed. If Ymir is a personification of the earth, then what the Norse were really saying is that the blood of the earth, which is lava and water, came out of the earth and caused a worldwide flood, and this was said to have drowned most, but not all, of the giants. A type of Jotnar, called trolls, were said to have become vulnerable to sunlight, and they stayed inside of the caves. The trolls became grotesque, slow, and dim-witted, but also very strong, and known for drinking blood and consuming humans, while the Elfar were described as slender and elusive, which could possibly be indicative of different branches of speciation, as the descendants of these separate populations of pre-flood entities adapted to their various post-flood environments over time. In the ancient Greek epic, the Odyssey, Homer describes a giant called Polyphemus, who Odysseus and his team had encountered. Polyphemus had lived in a cave, and he blocked the entrance with a giant stone. And Polyphemus often left his cave in order to gather resources, and to let his sheep graze. According to the Odyssey, and Greek mythology in general, the Cyclops usually preferred to live in their own caves, rather than to share a cave. But there were other types of giants who were said to live together. For example, there was said to have been a colony of man-eating giants who lived in the caves high in the mountains in Sicily. The ancient Greeks believed that the giants existed, and they attributed many of the ancient megalithic structures to the giants, specifically the Cyclops, hence the term Cyclopean masonry. The giants were said to have been born from a union between the deities of the sky and the earth, which would be an allegory for the union between the Watchers and the humans. During an event called the Gigantomachy, the giants were either killed in battle or forced into hiding and sealed beneath the earth. And after the Gigantomachy, the flood of Deucalion occurred, which was said to have been so extensive that it covered the entire world, with Deucalion and his wife, Pyrrha, surviving in an ark. But aside from them, there were said to have been some other survivors of the flood who had not been on the ark, and these survivors were said to have been giants who had fled into the caves in the mountains in order to escape the flood. One of the more notable examples of giants existing after the flood pertains to the Anakim and Rephaim tribes that the Israelites had battled in Canaan, and people often wonder how there were giants after the flood. They wonder, was it an inconsistency in scripture, or if there was a second incursion of Watchers after the flood, or did the wives of Noah's sons have Nephilim DNA? But there's a more likely explanation as to why the descendants of the Nephilim were still around after the flood. Jesus had said in Matthew 24:37 that the circumstances surrounding his return would be comparable to the events preceding the flood in Noah's time. And Isaiah 2:19-20 states, "People will hide in caves in the rocky hills, or dig holes in the ground, to try to escape from the Lord's anger and to hide from his power and glory when he comes to shake the earth. When that day comes, they will throw away the gold and silver idols that they have made and abandon them to the moles and the bats. And the Book of Revelation states that everyone, rich or poor, will flee underground during the end times. They'll hide in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. The Nephilim and other pre-flood life had hidden when the catastrophe began. They had hidden in caves in the rocky hills and dug holes in the earth to protect themselves. And some were able to hide themselves in a place where the water wouldn't reach them, but most of the others had perished. After the Great Flood, the survivors re-emerged, and most of the existing post-flood groups of giants were named after those who they had descended from, such as the Anakim and the Rephaim. But sometimes these groups were given different names based on their other attributes, like the Emim, whose name means the dreaded ones, the Zamzumim, which either comes from the Hebrew term zimzum, which means to contract or retreat, or it comes from the Hebrew word zamzam, which means to make a humming or buzzing sound, which also has some pretty interesting implications. And another term that was used for the post-flood descendants of the Nephilim is Horite, which fittingly means cave dweller. The Horites were said to have lived in the region of Mount Seir, which is actually Petra. And the caves that the Horites had dwelled in were actually the artificial caves of Petra, even though Petra was heavily eroded by water during the flood. There are still many sections that had remained intact, and they could have been sealed to prevent water from entering. It's explicitly stated in scripture that the Nephilim were in the earth in those days, and that when the flood happened, it specifically destroyed life from the face of the earth. Then, after the flood, these people and their offspring re-emerged from their natural and artificial hiding places, not just in the Middle East, but all across the world. So it's pretty extensively documented that people had escaped a great flood in the ancient past, not only by building durable structures, but also by going underground. Just because the flood was worldwide and covered the entire surface of the earth, doesn't mean that the water found its way into every crevice underground. In fact, there could be a lot of spaces underground that water simply wouldn't find its way into. If these chambers have higher air pressure, it would keep the water out. It would also carry in and deposit a lot of sediment, which can block up the tunnels and prevent more water from entering. They might have to deal with having very scarce resources, but surviving for a year inside of a cave system during the worldwide flood is certainly possible. People really underestimate how many caves are below the ground. In places like the Mojave Desert and the Red Desert, you can see numerous cave systems as you walk along, since there isn't any brush covering the entrances. But all across the world, there are places with the same number of cave entrances, if not more. But most people don't know about their existence, because their entrances are so often covered by vegetation. Small cave entrances and sinkholes leading to vast underground cave systems are discovered on a regular basis all across the world. And there are many modern examples of people finding refuge inside of air pockets, inside of otherwise flooded caves. In 2018, a group of 12 youth soccer players and their coach had entered into a large cave in Thailand called the Tham Luang Cave as a part of the team's initiation rites, because apparently it's a tradition for teams to go into caves in the area and write their names on the walls. But the Tham Luang Cave is over 10 kilometers long, and as the team neared their 4th kilometer of walking, a surge of floodwaters from a sudden monsoon rushed into the cave. The group quickly made their way up to a narrow rock shelf as the waters barreled past them and filled the rest of the cave. If that ledge had not been there where the team was at the time, they very well could have been swept up in the waters and drowned. And that alone goes to show how being in the right place at the right time can be crucial to surviving a sudden catastrophe. The group was trapped in there for 18 days, but they were able to survive by licking the cave walls for minerals and water. And they used meditation techniques, which not only helped them to cope with the stressful situation, but it also helped them to conserve energy, reduce their metabolisms, and limit their oxygen usage. And while they had brought in snacks, they only brought in enough to last them for a couple of hours. But instead they had to stretch out their supply to last them for the 18 days that they ended up trapped in the caves. In large enough cave systems, the pre-flood organisms could have similarly found shelter on a ledge or in a chamber above the stream of water flowing. And generally, if there's water running through the cave, that would circulate the air, so oxygen's not something that they would have had to worry about. They would just need to be able to conserve their energy and possibly find some sources of food. The Namtalu cave incident is another very relevant example of how some can survive in a flooded cave while others are drowned. In October of 2007, a group of tourists visiting the Namtalu cave in Thailand had made their way through the cave, reaching a depth of about 500 meters, when a sudden flash flood occurred from a rainstorm outside. Water rushed into the cave and knocked everyone off their feet instantly and drowned them, save for two people, a woman named Helena Carroll and her fiancé John Cullen. They had both made their way up onto a ledge quickly enough, just out of reach of the water. But after a while, John Cullen decided to swim through the water in order to escape the cave and get help. But as soon as he jumped into the water, the current knocked him off his feet and he drowned. Over 24 hours later, a search and rescue team arrived because no one had come back out of the cave, and Helena Carroll was rescued and survived. She didn't have any significant issues breathing inside the cave, and she was able to drink the floodwaters for hydration, although her modern human anatomy had caused her to experience a mild sickness afterward. And there were plenty of snacks for her to eat inside the cave, in case she got hungry. Even if there was far more water entering the cave, there would be areas where the floodwaters wouldn't reach, and a more agile organism, like an ancient person, would likely be able to evade drowning and reach a ledge where the water doesn't reach. In 2017, there was a diver named Josh Bratchley who had gotten lost while exploring Flint's Lick in Tennessee, and he was able to survive in an air pocket that he found in the otherwise fully submerged cave until he was rescued. And coincidentally, he had helped with the rescue of the soccer team that was stranded in the Tham Luang cave a year earlier, so he already knew that he could have survived for a pretty long time in that air pocket if he needed to. In 2022, spelunkers in Missouri had come across a dog who had been stranded deep inside of a cave for over 2 months. This dog was trapped over 500 feet underground, and it was able to survive for months in this cave despite having access to very little resources, by relying on its body fat reserves, sleeping to conserve energy, finding cave animals to eat, and drinking water from the underground river. Dogs can see better in the dark than humans, but it was completely pitch black down there. So for the most part, the dog had to rely on its sense of smell and hearing to find any cave animals to eat. But on the other hand, most of the pre-flood people would have been able to come up with some source of light to help them see in the caves. Many people involved in shipwrecks were able to survive by locating air pockets that remained after the ships were fully submerged. When there's no passage upwards, the air becomes trapped in these cabins and in the hull when the ship capsizes. And then people on the ships can stay in these air pockets for long enough until rescue teams find them. And also beneficially for any organisms attempting to survive inside of caves during a flood, some gases that are in the air, like carbon dioxide, are able to dissolve in water and exit the air pocket chambers through the water-filled sumps outside of the air-filled chambers. And oxygen is less soluble than carbon dioxide, so the oxygen remains in the air pocket while the carbon dioxide leaves. But as the carbon dioxide leaves, it can sometimes reduce the size of the air pocket, so it would be important to conserve energy so that less CO2 is produced due to exhalation. In most cases, the water that enters into these cave systems would gradually make its way down into the aquifers and then drain out as the floodwaters recede. So after a while, the organisms trapped inside of these caves during the flood would eventually be able to leave, assuming that they had been able to survive otherwise. The thought that caves are filled with toxic gases mainly refers to caves that either have no airflow, contain large amounts of decaying matter, or they're filled with coal, which produces carbon monoxide when it's heated or oxidized. but only post-flood cave systems would contain coal, because coal was formed by organic matter that accumulated and was compressed during the flood. And algae would be another possible supplier of oxygen. There are many different types of algae, such as diatoms, which can survive deep in caves without light. If the pre-flood entities who had escaped into cave systems, or even in an artificial structure to survive the flood, had brought light sources in with them, they may have also enabled more algae to start growing in a short period of time, which would produce more oxygen for them to breathe. If you have artificial lights in a cave, like from a fire or a light bulb, these lights can enable algae to grow, as long as these lights contain the correct wavelength to enable photosynthesis to occur. And once a light source is introduced into a cave, algae begins to grow visibly in as little as a few days, depending on the intensity of the light, as well as the existing population of algae in the cave, and other conditions like temperature and water availability. For example, in the Carlsbad Cavern in New Mexico, there's artificial lights that were hung up for tourism, and deep inside the cave, where there's normally no light, algae has started to grow because of the lights that were used. And bioluminescent organisms in caves could also provide some light, which would actually be sufficient at growing algae as well. The deepest known cave is the Variovkina Cave in Georgia, which has a depth of over 2,204 meters. And this cave system doesn't just plunge straight down, it goes down at an angle, and it has a lot of branching paths and chambers. And at the bottom there's a complex network of chambers, and this is where any water that does enter the cave drains down into. And there are several other extremely deep karst caves in Georgia alone, and these cave systems are very similar to the layout of ant nests, but on a larger scale. And on that note, think about how ant nests survive floods. The nests that are built by ants can range from a few inches underground to over 25 feet deep. These tunnels channel water away from the nest and into the lower areas, and the soil itself also absorbs a lot of water, and this is also the case for cave systems, hence the existence of underground aquifers. And ant nests have a layout that traps air in various chambers, and importantly, the entrances to these chambers comes from below, which prevents water from entering into the chambers due to gravity and air pressure. And when it rains, ants also block the entrances to their nests. And artificially built ancient underground structures, despite being much larger in scale, have a very similar layout to ant nests, and they utilize similar features, which also helps them to manage floodwaters. And other types of animals prevent their burrows from flooding by digging their tunnels at an upwards angle. They build their shelters in a V fashion, digging downwards to a certain point, and then back upwards, which has the same functionality as sumps in cave systems. And many animals will block their burrow entrances with dirt to prevent water from entering, like how many caves were covered over by sediment, which prevented water from entering. The flood-deposited sediments were dissolved by karst processes over time after they were deposited, and oftentimes, caves extend very deep underground and lead to older pre-flood cave systems. While pre-flood organisms would naturally not use post-flood cave systems as shelters, since they didn't exist until the flood created them. But the cave systems that existed before the flood, that these organisms would have used as shelters, do still exist, even though they're oftentimes buried. But even out of those that had been buried, many of them have since been re-exposed to the surface, as the sediment that was deposited over them has dissolved over time, creating sinkholes and tunnels that lead to these older pre-flood cave systems. And speaking of how older structures were buried during the flood and were since re-exposed due to the covering sediment being worn away, there's actually a lot of artificially built ancient underground structures that were actually recently discovered this way, with the sediment that had been deposited over them during the flood later wearing away and re-exposing these structures to the surface. For example, in the late 1970s, there was an earthquake in Orvieto, Italy. And when this earthquake occurred, there was a landslide, which exposed an underground cavern. But when they went inside, they discovered that it was actually an enormous ancient underground city, very similar to Derinkuyu. And in 2003, there was heavy rainfall, which wore away sediment around the Temple of the Feathered Serpent at Teotihuacan, which caused a sinkhole to open up. And after this sinkhole was investigated, tunnels were discovered under the pyramids, which no one knew had existed beforehand. And there were also karst caves before the Great Flood, and these karst caves were formed from the rocks that the earth was initially made from, such as inorganic limestone, dolomite, and gypsum. There were also tectonic caves and pyroducts, which were forming up to the time of the Great Flood. And these tunnels are complex and usually branch into distributary patterns, which form into chambers that can become air pockets in the event of flooding. And pre-flood organisms could have used pyroducts to shelter themselves during the Great Flood. Caves consisting of non-permeable rock, such as pyroduct caves, would be especially impervious to flooding, because water isn't able to seep through the cave walls, the way that water enters into underground aquifers that are composed of permeable rock. And lava doesn't come back through pyroducts once they've drained, because future lava flows usually create new tubes, rather than reusing the old ones, so anything inside of a pre-existing pyroduct would not usually need to worry in the event of another eruption. The longest pyroduct cave discovered so far stretches over 40 miles, or 64 kilometers, and extends for over 1,102 feet, or 336 meters, underground. And this pyroduct is known as the Kazumura Cave in Hawaii. And one section of the Kazumura Cave was even converted into a fallout shelter. Another area that contains a vast amount of ancient pyroduct systems exists near Mount Shasta in California, specifically in the Lava Beds National Monument, which contains over 700 pyroducts. And most of these lava tubes have not been extensively explored, so it's unknown how deep many of them really are. The pyroduct caves of Shasta County are one of the world's most prominent hotspots for Bigfoot sightings. These creatures are described as, on average, being over 8 feet tall and covered in reddish hair, as most of the giants recorded throughout world history are. And the pyroducts in the Lava Beds National Monument date back many thousands of years, so the pre-flood entities could have very well fled beneath this region in order to survive the flood. And while the descendants of many of these entities still reside underground to this day, they often resurface for supplies, which is why they're sighted so often outside of these cave systems. And these pre-flood cave systems are abundant in the northwestern United States as well. North of California, a Native American tribe called the Coast Salish frequently encountered these cave-dwelling entities, who they called the Sasquatch, which is the origin of the term Sasquatch. The Coast Salish believe that the Sasquatch are guardians of the cave systems, and many of these caves are older than they appear. And over time, the sediment builds up over the walls and floors of these caves, and this often obscures the cave's original features. And this can cause them to be falsely interpreted as having formed solely out of sedimentary rock. There are many places across the world, aside from in caves, where organic sediments had been deposited and lithified on top of older igneous rock formations, such as on the Greenstone Flow in Michigan, the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia, and Mount Everest in the Himalayas. For those in artificially built structures and bunkers, they probably would have brought resources like food in with them. But for those who fled into caves, they may not have taken along any resources, so how would they survive? Cave animals don't have too much difficulty finding food in caves, as long as they're willing to eat detritus, guano, and other animals, including their own kinds. Many species, such as bats, salamanders, olms, and most cave insects, are able to enter into dormancy, or hibernation, and that helps them to deal with any situations where there might be less resources than normal. And likewise, ancient people may have had adaptations and more efficient bodies that could have allowed them to survive with lower than ideal oxygen in these cave systems for long periods of time. A modern example of this can be seen in the Sherpas in the Himalayas, who have also physically adapted to not suffer from hypoxia when they're on the tops of Mount Everest, where normal people have extreme difficulty breathing, and they have to rely on supplemental oxygen, or else they experience severe hypoxia. But the Sherpas are able to breathe at the top of Mount Everest without any supplemental oxygen due to their genetic adaptations. And the Sherpas have a larger total lung and vital capacity compared to regular humans, and this means that their lungs can hold more air and more efficiently exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. The Sherpas have genetic variations that allow them to utilize oxygen more efficiently, which includes changes in their genes related to mitochondrial efficiency and oxygen transport. In the Philippines, there's a group called the Basajaun, who are known for being able to hold their breath underwater for extended periods of time, up to 10 minutes. The reason why they can do this is because they have genetic adaptations that allow them to stay underwater for much longer than regular people. Studies have shown that the Basajaun people have significantly larger spleens compared to other types of humans, and this helps them to store more oxygen when they're diving. And similarly, the Ama pearl divers in Japan were able to develop exceptional breath-holding abilities just by training and practice, so they don't even need diving equipment while they search for pearls for long periods of time underwater. And like the Basajaun, these pearl divers have also been found to have larger than normal spleens and higher lung volumes, which would help them to hold their breath for long periods of time. And researchers have found that Neanderthals had over 20% larger lungs compared to modern humans, which enabled them to utilize oxygen more efficiently because they have more alveoli. And Neanderthals were significantly more athletic than modern humans, meaning that they would have had more efficient respiratory systems, and their bodies were adapted to going long periods of time without food or water. And since they were healthier, they would also be able to adapt faster to new environments. And so, when these pre-flood people had gone down into the caves, their bodies were more readily able to function, even if there was less oxygen. And if they could do that, then they could adapt to environments that have lower oxygen, as long as the oxygen doesn't fall below the baseline that their bodies need to function. And these abilities wouldn't just apply to Neanderthals, but any type of pre-flood creature. But the lower oxygen levels in some of these caves might explain why so many of the giants in post-flood mythology were thought to have been dim-witted, because some of them, if they had found themselves in caves that had too low of oxygen, even lower than normal caves, they may have suffered from hypoxia, which could have caused brain damage. As stated earlier, the Hopi claim that their ancestors had been taught how to grow beans deep inside of caves that they had seeken refuge in for a long period of time while they waited out a catastrophe. And the fact that they were able to grow beans at all in these caves indicates that they had some source of light. Plants can grow with most types of light, so whatever light source they had with them probably would have been sufficient. And the reason why they had grown beans and not other types of plants is because beans require very little resources to grow, and they produce a high yield in a pretty short amount of time. And it's definitely worth noting that the Hopi were not the only subterranean people who had relied on beans as a source of food. In the folklore of Gozo, which is an island in the Maltese archipelago in the Mediterranean Sea, a female giant named Sansunna was said to have emerged from caverns beneath the Ggantija temple thousands of years ago, which she had attempted to reconstruct, since it had been destroyed during the flood. Sansunna was accustomed to eating raw fava beans, which is the only thing that she ate aside from honey, likely because she had become accustomed to eating them during her sheltering, and probably began to rely on eating them as a source of comfort. The green children of Woolpit, who had emerged from a subterranean civilization and ended up in Woolpit, England, in the 12th century, were also known for having refused to eat anything until they were presented with raw fava beans, which they solely ate for a long period of time, until they were gradually introduced to other foods. Both of the children had pale but noticeably green skin, which slowly faded away over time. The boy ended up perishing, however, because he wasn't able to acclimate to the new environment and diet. They spoke an unrecognizable language, and they wore unfamiliar clothes, unlike anything made in England in the 12th century, and they acted very nervous, because they weren't used to being on the surface. Once the girl was taught how to speak English, she claimed that she and her brother had come from an underground place, where the light was always dim, without the day and night cycles that we know. She explained that she and her brother had wandered off into an underground cave tunnel, and the kids got lost, and they followed the sound of some bells that they were hearing, which led them to the surface world. The reason why both of these children had green skin is likely due to anemia, specifically hypochromic anemia. these kids had refused to eat anything but raw beans, and they indicated that their diet was the same before they came to the surface. While fava beans contain a decent amount of non-heme iron, they don't contain any heme iron, which is found in meat. And since they had lived in caves, their skin was extremely pale, which made their discoloration even more noticeable. And people with the G6PD deficiency are prone to a specific condition called favism, which causes an abnormal breakdown of red blood cells when a person consumes fava beans specifically. And this condition is even more likely to occur if the person doesn't eat other types of food. The symptoms of favism include pale skin, jaundice, fatigue, and abdominal pain, which could have contributed to their overall lack of appetite. And jaundice can cause skin to appear green, especially when bilirubin and biliverdin levels are extremely high. The fur of animals can even turn green due to this condition, which again is more noticeable when the fur of the animals is normally white, and then the green hue from the high biliverdin is much more easily noticeable. And the green children of Woolpit had over time lost their green hue after they had stopped eating fava beans and started to eat other types of food that contained heme iron, which would have helped to treat their anemia and their favism. And because they were introduced to the sun in the first time in their lives, they would have sunburnt very easily, which would have increased the melanin levels in their skin and caused their skin to darken, which would have made their green coloration less noticeable. The girl had said that their father had also lived underground with them, and she claimed that he had actually set up a type of farm, like the ancestors of the Hopi had done, and the girl's father had grown crops, presumably of beans, and he also raised cattle. But the fact that the children had refused to even eat meat when they had come to the surface implies that the kids were never given beef to eat, possibly because the beef was reserved for certain members of their society due to it being a less abundant resource. And also, a vitamin D deficiency blocks your body's ability to effectively absorb iron. And so if these ancient people were trapped in caves, or in structures without sunlight for long periods of time, even if they did consume some meat, they would still be at a higher risk of developing anemia. So all of the evidence indicates that in the ancient past, people all across the world had fled undergrounds to escape the worldwide flood. Some of these populations re-emerged after the flood, while others remained undergrounds, and some only briefly surfaced to gather resources, as they may believe that it isn't yet safe for them to re-emerge, or they may have become accustomed to cave dwelling. And there are others who had re-emerged, and they were either worshipped, or they were driven off. Another interesting note is that only the post-flood giants were described as having polydactyly, and this could very well be due to the fact that their ancestors had been dwelling in caves, where there's often high levels of radiation, and possibly they were also inbreeding, which could have very well led to corruptions in DNA, which would explain the mutations that are often described in the descendants of the Nephilim. And although many of these giants were described as strong, many of these other cave dwellers and their descendants were much weaker and not well adapted to surface dwelling, which is how they were able to be more easily driven off. And there are other ways in which populations could speciate after living in subterranean environments over many generations for thousands of years, since their ancestors had gone into hiding in the cases where they had not re-emerged. And keep in mind that before the flood, there were more than just humans and giants. So depending on the biological abilities of these organisms, they may have been more or less capable of surviving undergrounds using various means. The legends of Hollow Earth, Inner Earth, Agartha, whatever one wishes to call it, may be true, but just in a different way than you may have visualized before. Thank you to those who have supported Shattered History since the last video. M.R., Scooby Clark, John R. Amun, Ambugaton, A.L.V., Liam Flatley, Mama Lou, and Louise Armstrong.